2022. This is the second time we are doing this in virtual, and we hope to go offline from next 2 months, all our events. Today, we have been joined by the eminent speakers from India and abroad and from the government industry to talk about the open source, how secure is open source, what are the new challenges in open source. As you all aware that government of India is all set for the open source in India. So let me take this opportunity to welcome our chief guest, Shri G. Narendranath, an ITS officer. He is presently a Joint Secretary at National Security Council, Government of India. Madam Deepa Tyagi, an ITS officer, Senior DDG and Head Telecommunication Engineering Center, Government of India. The keynote is none other than the well-known Mr. Jeff Williams, who is the co-founder and the CTO, Contrast Security. Jeff, sorry to bother you the early midnight and the early morning to join us on this virtual, but this virtual made to listen to you as we can't go offline now. Soon we will hope to see you in India to hear about you from what are the next things in the security. We have Golak Kumar Samil. Samil is the CTO, Passport Seva Project, Ministry of External Affairs. Thank you, Golakji, joining us today.
Thank
Dr.
you,
SD Sundarsan, Executive Director, C-DAC Technology Group, National Informatics Center. Dr. Devrat Naik, Head of Cybersecurity, National Payments Corporation of India. So I welcome all of you to this inaugural session. First, we'll have the three speaks, and then Harnath Babu, who's the CIO of KPMG in India, will do the panel discussion. So I welcome all of you to the 5th edition of Open Source Virtual Summit 2022. So now let's listen to G. Narendranath, Joint Secretary, National Security Council of India.
So good morning, and I'm happy to be part of this event on the Open Source Virtual Summit and to give the keynote. And I thank the organizers of the event for this opportunity to me to be part of this event. The first question that I would like to ask is why open source? With the Digital India program, you will find that there's a large-scale deployment of infrastructure, hardware, and software that grows across the government for providing access to the citizens of this country for different digital services. Now, the government, recognizing that it will involve a huge cost that is there, and there are other issues which I'll come in my talk, came up with policies with a mindset that we should start using open source software for optimizing the cost and then to reduce the total cost of ownership of the infrastructure that goes into this. That is one important part of the Digital India program. The other, of course, is that the software platforms could be an entry barrier to people who would like to participate in designing and developing solutions. So the open source actually would help in democratizing the participation in the development of solutions. So this is the reason why open source is important. And there's a very good community of developers who participate actively in developing open source solutions. So we have the policy on the adoption of open source software for the Government of India. Then there's a policy on the collaborative application of development of open source, opening the source code of government applications. And there's a policy on the open APIs also. There's also national data sharing and accessibility policy. So there's a policy framework that has also been established for for open source to be used in government applications. The National Policy on IT of 2012, as early as 2012, also talked about adoption of open standards and promotion of open source and technologies. So per se, it's very important from the government perspective that open source is fostered, both from the point of view of reducing the total cost of ownership and also to democratize the participation and development of solutions. Quite recently, especially with respect to the infrastructure that is developing, you will find that there is a concentration and very few companies which are there in the telecom infrastructure area. And across the world, there's an initiative for coming up with open standards. There are open standards, but for coming up with open source software and opening up further parts of the total technology stack. So you would have heard of the Open RAN initiative, the Open Radio Access Network initiative, where the work is towards the openness, disaggregation of the RAN network, because RAN, is around 70% of the network cost, and making interoperable network elements. So in addition to the standards being defined, between the core and the radio access network, which is open so that you could have vendors coming with the core elements and separate vendors coming up with the radio access network. Now we are actually taking the disaggregation further down into RAN and disaggregating the RAN with open source and open standards so that we have multiple players. We have vendor diversity that comes in. And we go away from this current environment where we have very few big vendors who are supplying equipment. So that provides opportunities for a wider community of companies to participate in the digital economy. Having said that, there are certain issues that require to be taken care of when we talk of open source. One is on the standards. And it's very important that we have standards, because unless we have standards, we will not have interoperability, and it will not be possible to multiple players to develop their own pieces of the software and then put it together. So that is one important part. The other important part is regarding the security. You must have all heard of the Log4j vulnerability that came about from an open source software that was widely used for enterprise logs, for the system logs to be maintained. And that's so that's where who handles the security part, who takes responsibility for it. So that is another aspect of the open source, about how do you handle the security when you have multiple players or multiple entities developing the software, and then you are merging it together. Who takes the responsibility for that? So this is one important area. And when I talked about the Open RAN, that is one area that they're working on to ensure that when you have big enterprises developing software, there is there's a maturity in these companies in the sense of processes that they have for development of the software. And would assume that because of the maturity of the processes that they have and the robustness of the processes that they have, that the secure software comes out of it. But when we have multiple entities coming up with development, so what are these secure by software, secure design principles that should be uniformly applied across all of them is a challenge that is to be addressed. And how do you address the security piece of it? Let us assume that there's a big actor who would actually want to infect systems under development, and they put together teams and then develop modules which get integrated. Unless we have a robust mechanism of testing those modules before they become part of the open source software stack, it is quite possible it would be done. We have a case of one university which, as a prank case, developed a piece of software, and they were part of the community, and to see if it would pass muster. And that software got incorporated into those open source, and they published a paper on that. Of course, it is understood that the university got debarred from participating further in the development activity at the part of the community. But still, that shows that that is one area that requires to be addressed when you have open source software. That's why you find that when people are deploying some software for enterprise critical systems, they tend not to go for open source, or if they're going for open source, to have a support system, or to go in for a company which provides them software support, because the skill sets required for using a software as a tool is different from the skill sets that are required for maintaining the tool. So these is a challenge, and I think the discussions, deliberations you have today would look at these certain challenges which are there that require to be addressed to provide trust in the use of open source. Open source has come to stay. It's not that we raise questions of why open source now. That's come to stay, and we're going to use open source. It's just a question of looking at those aspects, those challenges that are there in using of open source, and make it more widely acceptable, and to make it more secure and to make it trustworthy is some of the things. And I hope that your event today, the virtual summit today, would look into some of these aspects and work towards those solutions and provide a pathway for that. And I wish the virtual summit success and the best wishes for all the participants and all the speakers for the event. Thank you very much.
Audio of the G. Narendra ji, but I'll make sure that all of you get the video, so that all the delegates has been able to hear him very clearly, but speakers could not. So I'll send across the video so that you can hear what Sri G. Narendra ji said. Now, may I request Madam Deepa Tyagi, Senior DDG, Head of Telecommunication Engineering Center, to address the gathering. She has 35 years experience in the Indian telecom sector, electronics and communication engineering. She is from IIT Roorkee, ITS batch of 1983. Welcome, Madam Deepa Tyagi.
Thank you, Mr. Shashidharan, and thank you to the event managers, and especially Shashidharan, for having given me this opportunity to speak on this occasion.
Ma'am, I request you to unmute your video.
Madam, please go ahead. Yeah.
So, well, let me start from my National Digital Communications Policy 2018, which talks about strengthening telecom infrastructure, IoT, 5G. And as we all know, 5G is round the corner. Hopefully, by the end of this year, we should be through with the spectrum auction. And early next year, we should see some initial rollouts of 5G networks in the country. Of course, 5G talks about 3 different use cases: ultra reliable and low latency networks, massive machine type communications, and ultra high mobile broadband networks. So clearly, IoT M2M domain is going to be a key use case in the 5G initial rollouts in the country. And as per our NDCP policy, we've said that by 2022, we need to have an ecosystem ready for 5 billion connected devices. So now we are all in the 2020. So let's see how things shape up. Now, globally, platforms have been the key drivers for adoption of IoT, and rapid proliferation of these proprietary platforms have led to fragmentation. So that's the negative part of it. But IoT can be further accelerated with the development and adoption of standardized platforms. And India has recently announced 1M2M standards as national standards, and this hopefully should lead to standards-based platforms, and it should go a long way in proliferation of 1M2M networks in smart cities and so on. But coming back to today's topic, which is the focus is on open source. So let's see. In fact, IT industry has already benefited by open source for more than 20 years. And the question is, how do we bring the best practices of the IT industry to the telecom industry? Open technology is inextricably woven into our lives. We all know the benefits of that this brings into our lives. Today, GitHub has become the most popular platform for open source collaboration. And the telecom world too is moving in this direction, though gradually and slowly. The 3GPP release 15, which is the 5G standards, it defines the 5G system architecture. And a key component is service-based architecture, SBA, which enables modularization of network functions and aligns well with the network function virtualization, NFV and SDN principles. Now, these provide agility and flexibility in terms of resource placement and efficient resource utilization, reducing time to market for new services, and thus helping operators stay or get competitive. At its core, being open is a fundamental vision of how the world should work. In a world that increasingly runs on software and cloud services, the question businesses everywhere face today is no longer as to whether we should be open or closed. The question today is, how open should we be? By bringing our innovations into the open and investing time, talent, and resource into open source projects, we are not only deepening our commitment to open technology, but encouraging others to join us in building an open tech future we all can trust. But in order to provide massive amounts of bandwidth to a massive number of devices, there is a need to transform the network to be able to scale up and be agile while reducing cost. And network disaggregation with separation of user and control plane, separating out the network operating system from the underlying hardware, use of general purpose processing platforms. These are some of the keys to creating networks that are massively scalable, agile, and inexpensive. Open source will have an increasingly important role in future 5G networks. So leveraging open source is important for enabling a high performance, flexible, and 5G user plane. But let us take a look at the various open source initiatives in the telecom, both in the core as well as in the access networks. To be fair, there have been very significant initiatives in this area. NFV, Management and Network Orchestration, MANO as we call it, it is the HC-defined framework for the management and orchestration of all resources in a virtualized data center, including compute, networking, storage, and virtual machine resources. The main focus of NFV MANO is to allow flexible onboarding, sidestepping the chaos that can be associated with rapid spin-off network components. So let us look at the various initiatives that have happened in the core. So the mobile network can be broadly visualized as having three main components. On one hand, you have the customer premise equipment, the mobiles, the user equipment, then you have a radio access network, and then you have the core. So the core, you have a lot of these open source enhanced packet cores. We have VEPC, then we have OMEC, Open Mobile Evolved Core from Open Networking Foundation. That's a 3GPP compliant mobile core solution. Then we have Magma Core, which was initially started by Facebook Connectivity and TIP. Then we have Free 5G-C, which is a 5G mobile core network to implement the 5G-C as defined in 3GPP release 15 and beyond. And we have Open 5G Core, which is the Fraunhofer Focus Open 5G Core Toolkit, which practically implements the 3GPP 5G core network. Now let's have a look at the RAN, the radio access side also. There again, we have the most famous or the most talked about initiative of Open RAN Alliance, which is an industry consortium that promotes the definition of an open standard for the virtual RAN. And it primarily has two goals. One, of course, is the integration of machine learning and artificial intelligence techniques in the radio access network. And the second, more important objective of this is to define an agile and open architecture enabled by well-defined interfaces between the different elements of the RAN. Then some of the other lesser known initiatives are, we have a converged multi-access and core, COMAC as they call it. Then you have SD-RAN, then you have Ether, then you have again Magma, Alcrano Radio Edge Cloud, and so on and so forth. But what is a little disturbing is the fact that you have so many open source projects that the standardization and interoperability becomes a challenge. So let's see how exactly are we going to address these issues. In fact, yesterday as I was just noting down my points for today's event, I came across a very important research to 2021 Open Source Security and Risk Analysis report by Synopsys. And it has come out with some excellent insights of the current state of open source security, compliance, licensing, and code quality risks in commercial softwares. Firstly, licensing is a major issue at times. You have two different kinds of licenses. You have a permissive license and you have a copyleft license. And many times there are inherent conflicts in the licenses. Then what is really is the need of the hour is some kind of a software bill of material. This is a term which you are very familiar in the hardware domain, but a software bill of material becomes very important, wherein a comprehensive inventory of open source dependencies in a code base, they should be specified and declared and made public. Then there is a paragraph on vulnerabilities and security and some very interesting outcomes of this research. In fact, they say that 84% of these 1,500 plus code cases which they audited, they had at least one public open source vulnerability. And 60% of these had high risk open source vulnerability. When you say high risk, we mean vulnerabilities that have been actively exploited. And then a large number of these vulnerabilities, they reappeared year after year. An open source library with no vulnerability does not necessarily stay that way a year or a month, and sometimes even a week later. Because today probably it has no vulnerability, but tomorrow it just might have. So what is important is access to reliable and diverse source of vulnerability data. That becomes very critical for staying atop of open source risk. Similarly, vulnerability information should be pushed to developers or security teams via alert systems, which is being done to a great extent. Then if you look at the sustainability, now 91% of the open source code bases contained open source dependencies that had no development activity in the last 2 years. No feature upgrades, no code improvements, no security issues fixed over the past 2 years. Now, while volunteer communities continuously update code and address vulnerabilities faster than their proprietary software counterparts, there is no guarantee that they would continue maintaining the code indefinitely, or that they have the knowledgeable people on the board who are capable of maintaining the code. And interestingly, it also said that there is a price of popularity that you have to pay. When a code becomes extremely popular, its maintainers, that is people who maintain, who handle bug reports, the feature requests, code reviews, they have too much pressure on them. And with no corresponding growth of maintainers who maintain the project, the consequence is often the developer burnout, or many times even these open source projects are abandoned. So the problem was so severe that the Core Infra initiative was created to enable technology companies to collaboratively identify and fund these open source projects that are the need for assistance while still allowing developers to continue their work under the community norms that have made open source so successful. So I'm reminded of this saying, that we saw in Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. So paralleling growth of open source is a growth of risk too. So while as the open source usage is getting increased, there is also parallelly a growth in risk, especially around open source security, code quality, and sustainability. This is due to the fact that increased use of open source makes managing a dynamic, changing risk landscape more difficult. To meet the challenge, development teams need to have reliable and timely vulnerability information, comprehensive inventory of the open source dependencies, their software usages, accurate guidance of vulnerability, severity, and exploitability, and clear directions as to how to patch the affected open source. And another interesting insight that came out was that while malicious attacks tend to steal the spotlight, I mean, you hear all over in the media that it's a malicious attack, but more often the malicious attacks are not the cause. Code flaws introduced by the mistakes of the programmers can be just as disruptive and far more likely to impact open source projects. Almost 83% of the vulnerabilities for which alerts were sent were due to coding errors rather than malicious intent. So while our minister, Ashwini Vaishnavji, had also recently said that open source software is key for digital democracy, and it will help ordinary citizens get access to technology much more easily. And we've seen that there are a lot of initiatives even in the telecom area, both in the access as well as in the core. And our R&D unit, C-DAC, has also developed and enhanced packet core on open source software. But the only challenge that comes to my mind is whether these developments are really carrier grade. When you talk about a public telecom network, you talk about a carrier grade network, whether they are scalable, whether they are resilient, whether they are secure. Commercially viable networks, whether they support high performing KPI requirements that support real-time system needs. Customer experience, quality of service, end-to-end performance. These are some of the challenges which are yet to be addressed. Even O-RAN, see, if you look at 5G deployments around the world, out of those, they say 30% of them are on O-RAN, which is Open RAN based. But they are mostly greenfield networks. That is, networks who are starting from scratch. So is it possible to convert or transform your existing proprietary network into a network which can suddenly one fine day turn open source? No, that's a challenge. So all these Open RAN deployments have been successful in greenfield networks. Second, they have been very successful in rural areas, because rural areas, there are no business cases for traditional networks, which are very costly. So they're probably, because they bring in a lot of cost reduction and ease of deployment and lower time to market, they are good for rural areas. And in fact, even though we are seeing a large number of Open RAN deployments in the country, in the world, they say that not before 2028 would they really be able to overtake traditional RANs. And if you talk to the telecom service providers, they say that they would be willing to go to Open RANs, and because radio access technology, the component of the network contributes to almost 60% of the network rollout cost. So they would be too happy to sort of go to Open RAN installations, but they have to be convinced that it guarantees them the same end-to-end challenge of them is all interoperability. Because let's look back a couple of decades when AT&T and Verizon, they were an early mover in SDN and NBF space, but they are yet to have any concrete cost savings as it can point to from its virtualized software powered migration. In fact, many of them have declined to put cost saving metrics around the effort, because we have so many disparate, incompatible implementations of OpenStack today that many operators say that some vendors are now charging software development fees as they help them move from existing software onto OpenStacks. Cisco, in fact, is reported to have said once that, are they really open? When you have so many standards, I think they are proprietary, because the very fact that there are so many standards. In fact, you hear about a term which is hot tub parties, where actions get slowed down by the need to obtain industry-wide consensus. And that is what is happening in the telecom area, because the requirements of telecom networks are pretty much different from the conventional IT networks that we've known all this while. And as the IT best practices are now entering the telecom area, some of the new things that these open source consortiums would have to focus on are end-to-end performance, end-to-end quality of service, interoperability, conformance of the protocol. And in fact, testing and certification and ultimately interoperability is today seen as the biggest challenge in those platforms which underpin SD in an NFV space. In fact, interestingly, see, if you use an analogy of Apple's iOS App Store, the setup works pretty well because each app is specifically designed for the platform, thus assuring interoperability. But these apps don't necessarily need to communicate with each other, whereas most elements inside a carrier's SDN and NFV system would need to do so. So interoperability is one of those few key tenets which are underpinning the growth of global telecom industry. After all, communication will only work when everyone speaks the same language. In fact, 50 years back, when SMS interoperability was being introduced, this was a big challenge. An SMS sent from one carrier network would not be possible to be read in another carrier's network. Imagine the challenges when all that it required was 160 characters traveling from one network to another. And this was a big challenge. It was after a lot of efforts that SMSs were globally sent and understood and read by one and all. So that is the power of standardization. And I think it is reasonable to assume that world's network operators will at some point achieve software-powered virtualized interoperability, but it won't happen quickly and it won't happen cleanly. It is still a work in progress. That's my personal view, though highly aspirational. But imagine when SMS, which just involves 160 characters, it took so long. Imagine surely SDN and NFV are significantly more complex than an SMS. So clearly in telecom, while we are all eagerly awaiting, in fact, India, we are very seriously contemplating to set up these interoperability labs in the country because we have a huge community of startups who are working very actively in the open RAN. And there are players with smaller, not such deep pockets, and they say that the biggest challenge is interoperability. Today in the country, we don't have any labs wherein we can, while the radio access network has been disaggregated into different components, but interoperability between those disaggregated components is a challenge. And we need to provide certain interoperable tests capability in the country wherein these people can come and get their products tested. And the operators are not just interested in interoperability. The TSPs say mere interoperability is not enough. We need to have end-to-end performance at par with the traditional proprietary networks. Only then will it make sense for us to go open source. With this, I would like once again thank my event managers who have given me this chance to speak my mind on open source in the telecom domain. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Madam Deepa Tyagi. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. As she said, our minister said, open source software key for digital democracy. Having said that, the government is pushing for the open source technology in a big way. At the same time, we need to see how secure is our open source and how to secure our open source. To share his thoughts, I invite Jeff Williams, co-founder and CTO, Contrast Security. He will tell us how to secure our open source. His theme is fast and secure leveraging open source without getting hacked. Jeff, over to you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate the time. And I want to thank Mr. Nath, who earlier asked the question, who's responsible for open source and how do we gain trust? And also, I want to recognize Madam Tyagi. She shared many of the difficulties with open source security. And she asked, how do we know that open source is safe and reliable for high security, high reliability kinds of applications? Let me share my screen. So let me jump into this. My name's Jeff Williams. I'm the CTO and co-founder at Contrast Security. I've been a developer and an AppSec specialist and an open source contributor for over 30 years. I want to start with a little story. I fell in love with open source right away. As a developer, I loved searching through open source libraries and finding cool modules, cool pieces of code that I can use to build things. Later on, I started a consulting company and I used open source code to provide services, the tools and so on. We provided services with those. One of those services was training developers in how to write secure code. And to make the classes more interesting, I built a deliberately vulnerable application, a web application called WebGoat. And WebGoat was very successful. It made the classes more interesting and made it a lot of fun to take these classes. And a few years after that, I did something crazy. I decided to donate WebGoat to OWASP, the Open Web Application Security Project. And that choice, I don't think that many companies are willing to do that kind of thing because it's giving away valuable intellectual property. But the response was unbelievable. It was great marketing for my business. A community formed to make WebGoat better than I could have ever made it and my company could have ever made it. There are now dozens of Goat projects out there for different languages and different environments. And beyond all that, it was great for me. Contributing to open source projects helped me learn and grow. Contributing helped me feel like I'm making a difference. And over the years, I've created dozens of open source projects. Some of them are wildly successful, like the OWASP Top 10, and others nobody ever used. So I'm still doing it. I just released a new open source tool called JBOM to help software projects create their own software bill of materials, the SBOM that we mentioned a few minutes ago. So after that experience with WebGoat and writing the OWASP Top 10, I was asked to take over as the global chair of OWASP. Over time, it grew to 250 chapters around the world, hundreds of cool projects, many chapters in India and around the world. And if you want to get great at application security and open source security, definitely get involved with your local OWASP chapter. OWASP has had a massive effect on the security of the code in the world. For example, we were the first to point out the issues with open source. We added the OWASP, to the OWASP Top 10, we added a requirement to make sure you're not using libraries with known vulnerabilities almost a decade ago. And really, that's the power of open source, is that you and a few friends who are passionate about a particular topic, you can change the world. Now today, I want to talk to you about the power and the danger of open source because it's a balancing act. So first, if you're building software today, you have to go fast. In almost every sector, including the telecom sector that we were just talking about, the company that is the best at delivering great software into production fast will win. It's going to win the sector. Because, and this is what Mark Andreessen was talking about when he said that software is eating the world. There is massive pressure to go fast. And because we're delivering more code faster than ever in history, the only way to really do that is to leverage open source. It's free, it's good quality code, and it saves a ton of work. You couldn't possibly write a modern web application from scratch, from the ground up, without using an open source app server and framework and libraries. So I wanted to say, I've probably reviewed more code than almost anybody. I spent many years doing security code reviews on large enterprise applications. And generally, open source code is better quality than what you'll find in custom code written by companies. It gets a lot more scrutiny. It is much more active. It gets published publicly, and so it's scrutinized more. So that is a strong factor in recommending the use of open source. However, as we'll see in a second, it's not a panacea. So if you want to go fast, my first recommendation is absolutely use open source. We'll talk about all the places where it's used in just a second. Second, I recommend you get great at DevOps. You want to be really fast at producing code, automating your testing and deployment pipeline so that you create the infrastructure to move fast. So to me, this is the key to being great at software. But of course, you also have to be secure. And I want to take a second and challenge you to think about just how important software is in your life. Already today, you've almost certainly trusted software with your finances, your healthcare, your social life, your government, safety, food and drugs, power grid, water supply, national defense, almost everything. All of that code relies heavily on open source. So we heard a few minutes ago about the complexity of interoperability and why open source code shouldn't be trusted. I disagree. First of all, almost all open source, almost all app servers, APIs, frameworks, and so on are already open source. You're relying on them for critical stuff already. Second, I believe in transparency. I frankly don't trust code that isn't open and visible. So I believe that there's inherent security in transparency, and open source meets that need. But using open source does come with responsibilities. I love the Spider-Man quote, with great power comes great responsibility. Open source isn't totally free. It comes with duties that you have to follow. So the first thing is you have to use open source safely. You've got to keep it up to date. It's not just when a new vulnerability comes out. I want you to put processes in place that keep your open source code up to date all the time. That's the fastest way of staying safe when a new vulnerability like Log4Shell comes out. And you have to use open source code safely itself. When you invoke it, your developers have to know how to use it correctly. Open source has powerful, dangerous functions in it. In one way of looking at it, the Log4j situation wasn't really a vulnerability in Log4j. It was just a powerful capability that developers weren't using properly. So be careful. You also need to test. I strongly encourage you to do interactive security testing on your application when it's fully assembled. You can really only test applications when the software and the libraries are put together into one thing. I don't want you to run one tool on your code and another one on your libraries. That doesn't work. They're one application and they depend on each other. So you really can't understand the code without understanding the libraries, and you can't understand the libraries without understanding the code. If you analyze them separately, you'll drown in false positives. And you need to test, because the average application out there has 25 serious vulnerabilities, and several of those are in insecure libraries. That is way too much. We need to drive that number way down. And the last thing is, I want you, in order to be secure, I want you to use runtime protection. This is a technology that hardens your custom code and your libraries against being exploited, even if they have vulnerabilities. And this runtime protection gives you great visibility into who's attacking you, what attack vectors they're using. And by making that information visible, it's a great way to motivate developers to do the right thing and remediate vulnerabilities. Second, runtime protection is already required by OWASP, it's required by PCI, which is the credit card standards, and it's required in the US federal government, the NIST standards. But even if it wasn't required, I would tell you to do it anyway, because it's crazy to deploy a web application or a web API without runtime protection. It did fantastic against Log4Shell. The companies that were using runtime protection were safe. So those are some of the keys to going fast and being secure. But I do want to take a second and talk about Log4Shell. It was a terrible vulnerability. It was a single unauthenticated attacker with a single HTTP request could take over almost every Java and application and API on the planet. That's a terrible vulnerability. Most organizations really struggle to deal with it. They're doing a lot of manual searching. Some are still searching. Spent lots of overtime. But I want you to prepare for the next Log4Shell, because there are thousands of Log4Shell vulnerabilities still out there. Even though I believe open source is the most secure way to produce applications fast, there are still tons of vulnerabilities in it. So you need to be aware. There are 37 million different open source library versions out there. And all the vulnerability research is done by a handful of volunteer researchers doing it in their spare time. So there's not really an organized effort to test all this open source code for security. And that means that it's potentially got lots of latent vulnerabilities in it. So if you want to protect against the next Log4Shell, you've got to be prepared. I want you to think about three processes. I want you to think about writing secure code, using libraries safely. I want you to lock down your supply chain to make sure that your libraries are up to date and don't have known vulnerabilities. And then I want you to ensure operational security with that runtime protection that I talked about. Those are the three key things to do if you want to make sure you're secure. Now, here's what I work on every day. It's the Contrast Secure Code platform. So our goal is to provide a fantastic secure coding platform that supports those three processes. We provide a variety of application security testing tools that you can use to test your custom code and your libraries together, because we include software composition analysis, library testing, in with our application security testing. So we test the whole application together as one thing. And of course, we can generate SBOMs for you instantly across all your applications. The last piece is we provide that runtime protection. So with a single platform, you can protect your applications from development all the way into production. And we work on a broad array of languages, as you can see here: Java, .NET, .NET Core, Node, Ruby, Python, Go, JavaScript, PHP, Kotlin, and Scala. So if you want to get better at going fast and being secure, I'd love to talk to you about what we can do to help. Now, I wanted to mention a couple of key metrics to focus on here in your organization to try to get better at application security. The first is the mean time to remediate. This is how long it takes you to remediate a new vulnerability that you introduced. And if you look at this blue line, this is using sort of traditional scanning tools. That interactive kind of testing I talked about, that's this dark blue line here. And we can reduce the number of days to remediate a vulnerability down to about a week across an organization. So I think that's really exciting. This is a very healthy way to produce secure code. I also want you to measure the vulnerability escape rate. This is the rate of introducing new vulnerabilities into applications. And if you're not doing, DevSecOps, if you've got a kind of an old school kind of program, you're probably introducing 5, 6, 7 new vulnerabilities in your applications each month. We want to drive that number down, hopefully to less than 1 per month, because preventing flaws from existing in the first place is way more effective than finding them, fixing them later, even if you've reduced your MTTR down to a very short amount of time. So this is about learning and getting better at secure coding. So if you do these things that I've recommended and bring development and security together, you can be much more efficient. It's about breaking down silos, remembering that security and development are both on the same team. We're all working to deliver secure code fast. So thank you for the time. We've got an exciting agenda of talks lined up. Be sure to check out Damien from Contrast, who will be speaking later with some more technical details. And if you have any questions for me, please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Here's my link, and shoot me a message. I'd love to talk to you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you very much for sharing the inside of the open source security. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, we will move now to the panel discussion, and Harnath Babu, the Chief Information Officer, KPMG India, is here. And the panelists are Golak Kumar Simili, CTO, Passport Seva Project, Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India, Dr. SD Sudarshan, Executive Director, C-DAC, Bangalore, Shri Ramesh R, Scientist F and Head Open Technology Group, Chennai National Informatics Center. Devrat Nayak from National Payments Corporation will join us later. He's stuck in the meeting. But meanwhile, I'll request Harnath to go ahead with the panel discussion. Harnath will have around 45 minutes panel discussion. Harnath, over to you.
Thank you, Shashi. Please confirm if I'm audible and visible both.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Sasi, I have
Great,
joined.
Oh, you're joined. Okay, good. Dr. Devrat Nayak, Head of Cybersecurity, National Payments Corporation of India, joined with us. Thank you, Dev.
Great. Thank you so much. And really great presentations by both Deepa ma'am and Jeff. I think certainly quite a lot of insights in terms of the boons and the pitfalls of open source. An interesting topic to have a conversation on. I think open source software obviously isn't only creating an alternative to proprietary software, but is also becoming a force multiplier to transform the organization primarily in their digital transformation journeys. I think we've seen quite a lot of adoption in last couple of years, and especially with the advent of cloud. OSS obviously has taken quite a leap in terms of how organizations have embraced the open source technology. In fact, government is promoting very extensively on the FOSS, right? And MeitY's FOSS for Gov innovation challenges, leveraging the innovation potential of FOSS community, especially startups and the community overall for solving some of the critical government tech initiatives. So today we have panelists who are from the majorly from the government industry or GovTech, and definitely we'll try to understand what is their strategy from an open source perspective, how are they leveraging open source, and I'm hoping that this session and the insights coming in from the panelists will be really helpful for the audience. So let me quickly jump into the questions. The first question for you, Golok, and I'm hoping that you're doing well, Golok. I think good to see you again.
Yeah, Harnath ji. Good morning. Very good morning. Yeah.
All good to see you.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, Shashi is one common thread. He always makes sure that all of us are connecting, right? So thanks a lot, Shashi, for that.
Thank you.
But let me. Sure. Let me quickly jump on the first question, Golok. So, how are you seeing the potential of open source in your organization, especially Passport Seva, and any examples that you want to cite, where you're leveraging the open source and the community to drive the innovation? And I know many of the innovation stories that you have been taking up, but has open source really contributed in the way you are trying to drive the innovation, and in a very fast and economical way, I would say?
Absolutely, Mr. Harnath. Thank you, and very good morning to all my co-panelists as well. I also thanks at the outset Sasi ji and his entire team for bringing me here in this discussion. Now, quickly coming back to the question, Harnath, you are absolutely right. Government at large, I'll say, not only the Passport Seva program, we are trying to see that we leverage maximum open source, but the idea is it's not about replacing one by another. I think That's the problem people are doing whenever they are trying to adopt open source. Rather, I'll say take a approach which strikes a balance between COT and open source. Now, let me quote an example here. For an example, when I connect to all other government agency, I have developed open APIs purely based on open source, right? So that other government agency consume very easily. Those APIs, they consume very easily. And those APIs, since it is developed in open source, if any kind of enhancement, improvement, like I was listening to Jeff and Deepa ma'am saying that, then it becomes easy for everyone of once and improve. The other problem we do, Harnath, you don't have a BRD setup within. You must develop a BRD setup. I always say that you have your own BRD setup, build, release, and develop deployment setup. That setup will not only anything and everything which is progressing towards a open source environment and the community, it will take care of the kind of a up-to-date scenario, but it will also suggest what are the vulnerabilities before you are moving into the production zone. It's not simply easy saying that somebody was saying that a open source product which is, let's say, 2-year-old, it is not going to meet your neither the kind of a product requirements, not the portfolio requirement, not the service requirement, right? So that is one very important area which we are doing and which probably other can imbibe upon. The second very important, if we are trying to leverage and kind of a huge open source maximum, if you see, if I divide them into 3 categories, one is the client interface, the service seeker interface, or the consumer interface. Second is the network interface. Third is the server and storage layer, and fourth, the down layer is your civil and electrical layer. I personally feel the consumer interface, the client interface, the service seeker interface, the network interface, the SDN kind of a technology coming into picture. And in the server layer, already you are using maximum of components, one or other, as part of your entire solution. The server layer and storage layer, if you ask me, already open source is there. It's not that it is not there. It is there. It's already there. So it's just that how do you leverage it and how do you take a holistic, I say, the kind of a visibility when you are trying to leverage open source. And for government, if you ask me, now it is high time, let's say government, any sort of, let's say I develop a transport application or I developed a passport seva program code. Can I make the source code available, the best practices available for the other government department or the other government ministry to to leverage it, to consume it, to improvise it, and then kind of a make it further use for other governments department. I think that is one of the area we have to work. But then to do that, we must have a standardized open source policy in place. We also must have a standardized open source collaboration application development platform in place. And also, we also must have an open source application programming kind of interfaces in place. Once we have these kind of a standardized policies in place, which can be easily imbibed and enforced, I don't foresee a challenge of adopting open source. But then, as I said, we need to create a
I think.
okay. Yes, Mr. Anand. I think that's my first take. Thank you.
Thank you, Golok. I think we missed last couple of statements. I think maybe the network wasn't.
No, if I quickly take maybe 30 seconds, saying that when I was saying that, if you see the service seeker layer, network layer, server, storage layer, and then down the line you have civil and electrical layer. I was saying that the service seeker layer, network layer, server and storage layer, OS layer, the open source is already existing. It's just that how do we take it to a next level, And to take it to next level, what I was saying that, no, especially within the government department, you have to, if you have to replicate the best practices, if we have to replicate the code available within one of us, right, then we have to have these kind of a open source policy enforcement in place. We have to have open source collaboration application development platform in place. We also ought to have open source application programming interfaces in place. If we can have it and continuously monitor it, improvise it, then India like a country, and you are talking about the kind of economy we are aiming for. I think open source is one of the area which gives us an opportunity to leverage maximum to divide this kind of a digital divide between rural and urban, and then you can reach to the remotest place at a faster pace. So that is how I think we should work towards in all government department and government at large. As you said, the government also now has a very focused way of moving. We have NRC FOSS for open source kind of a adaptability. We have mobile app development coming up very kind of a heavily based on open source. So those policies, those kind of a developments are already happening within the government, and government on the policy side also I think working on very in a larger way. But we have to also kind of work much more on that direction. That's how I believe.
I think thanks, Golok. I think very interesting points around trying to collaborate more. And again, government obviously is tightly integrated in terms of the citizen services, and certainly it's important for all the departments to stay connected and see how the best practices can be exchanged so as the code, right? So coming to you, Dr. Sudarshan, I think we heard Golok, and certainly his thoughts are around better collaboration and process for the build, release, and development, and obviously contribution to the community back. What are your thoughts on this particular subject?
Yeah, good morning, Harnath and the entire team. So it's a pleasure to be on this dais, and thank you from Mr. Sasi to the keynote speakers, Deepa Madam and Jeff brought out good points. And Golok actually gave a good opening statement as a first speaker of the panel. So FOSS, I currently working representing C-DAC here, and we are actually actively promoting FOSS, not only for internal usage. We actually actively propagate to the community, and if you by chance happen to go to Central E-Governance Hall at MeitY Ministry, we have actually a lot of software free for distribution. It is available on our website also. And not that it is just free or available openly. We also support certain critical strategic customers with open source operating systems. Like FOSS, we call it BOSS. So that is being supported for certain agencies, and we ensure that they are maintained and supported. So coming back to the point that you mentioned on collaboration and all, a few points to note. Open has been related to zero cost or free, and we have actually married a few things which need not be have been done, which has resulted in today's situation of good open source being used extensively, but not acknowledged or being accounted for. Today, you look at whether it is SSL, whether it is random number generators, or whether it is the web servers, even the quantum simulators, which are the latest in the trend. Most of the popular ones are actually open source. The challenge is, by making it free, we have actually started underplaying the role of open source contributors, which means only those who cannot, like below poverty line category, that is the kind of people who are forced to use open source development part of it. So that is where the biggest challenge is, because of which excellent functionality is there, but the front end and the usability factors are big question marks. So essentially, we end up having a not so jazzy looking front end, and not a great immediate support. You have to go through the FAQ document and somebody will answer your query in a discussion forum. Those are the things that are actually, I will say, the roadblocks in enabling collaboration. So only those who are forced to collaborate because of research purposes or because they cannot afford costs, they are going for it. The reality should be a little bit different in our opinion. Like Golak mentioned, we have to have a balanced view of costs and open source. And we should make open source economical rather than free. By making it economical, the entire community benefits. And today, that can happen if we start putting some resources which can help us develop the usability, take care of the usability aspects. In one sense, as Jeff mentioned, that shift left policy is extremely important in any development environment, because that reduces the field issues and bug fixing and triaging, which is always a challenge because the developer is moved on to another project and this is no more relevant or it is not on high priority agenda. So how do you do shift left? Which means we have to find a way the ecosystem should provide a baseline support for the open source developers. And that can happen by, one simple example is, instead of budgeting money for say capital and procurement, which typically happens in project. We have manpower, we have capital, we have contingency and all other stuff. Instead of, and they is generally said capital cannot be moved to manpower, manpower cannot be moved to capital. When you say open source, it is exactly that. What the software I'm going to buy as capital. Instead, if I put 2 manpower to support open source, probably the economics are better. We are also developing more technical capabilities with additional manpower, and it will enable better collaboration because the bandwidth is little more. The point of about handful of people working on it can be a little bit more than handful. I think that is the easiest way to go, and we should look at in a holistic picture and an economical manner. And this one final point I'll make is, today we are all looking at business continuity. COVID taught us, pandemic brought us suddenly, bring your own devices, not even bring, use your own devices, because I'm not even coming to office. So suddenly the entire ecosystem changed. So in such a case, how do you provide business continuity? That requires alternate technologies to be running in parallel, which are similar in nature, so that COTS technology X, open technology Y, and then a property technology Z, all the 3 should coexist, so that the layered security and vulnerability X can be covered by Y, Y can be covered by Z, and then overall the business runs. That is the way we have to look at it. I think the collaboration is not just among open source partners, but also among all the players in the IT and ICT ecosystem. And the users also should look at the economy rather than cost model. I think this is what I wanted to bring to the table as part of this panel. And if any other topic comes up, I'll be more happy to participate. But in the interest of time, thank you so much.
Sure. Thanks, Dr. Sudarshan. I think very interesting points that you brought out. I think I'll hold on to some of those points and come back to those. One is obviously free is just a misnomer. Obviously, there's a cost for everything, right? The second is, I think it's not about just using the software. I think most importantly, the support. Again, so I think to your point, can we make it economical than free, right? I think there are certain providers like Red Hat or SUSE or some of these providers, they are actually charging subscription for support, but certainly there is some bit of a comfort when you're using open source. And I think the most important part that you mentioned was business continuity. Do we have an alternate, right? Especially when you're looking at some of these softwares. And my favorite topic is the manpower. I'll come to that in some time. Especially around the skill areas, right? So, so coming to you, Rameshi, I think the whole policy on collaborative application development by open source, or let's say by opening the source code of government application, is it actually working in the favor, or do you think it's actually, or it's not, or maybe are you finding any meaningful contribution from the community? What's your experience on this?
Okay, well, good morning to everyone. Thanks for this opportunity. Hope you're able to hear me.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, I will just point out that NIC is a pioneer user of open source. So we have been using open source for quite some time. and whether it is government to citizen or government to government or any service, as Jeff also was telling, you may be touching any user will be crossing across an open source to get that service done. Maybe it's a deployment, or maybe it is the entire application or some component of application or the network. So somewhere the open source is there in all our services. So that is the first thing. And we have been consuming this for more than maybe 15, 20 years. So since the time Linux was released, so we have been into this business of deployment. So this particular question of contribution from community and collaboration with the community. So NIC is very active in setting up the resource centers. So through the resource centers, we have been trying to engage startups and work with the academia to collaborate and leverage the knowledge that is being developed by the startup companies and the academia. So that we look into those technology areas wherein emerging areas where we have new things to get into. So we have to migrate the existing services to newer platforms, because everywhere the data is growing like anything now. So we need to manage a large volume of data now. So we need to look into newer platforms. So in these areas, we want to collaborate. And I think we have already started collaborating on a couple of projects and a couple of our centers, or especially Center for the IoT and Center for Big Data and Center for Blockchain. They have been collaborating with in startups and industry. So there have been collaborations. It's started actually. So within the organization, we have been collaborating with all the project teams and sharing codes across project teams. So that kind of a collaboration is there within the organization. Now we are looking forward to collaborate with the industry and third party also. In general, contribution across from the collaboration from the community is only picking up now. It's not that it has gone to the level of one can directly consume that code and use it. Bits and pieces are there, but there is a long way to go. It's only a starting point for us. So we need to leverage from various points, maybe from the strategic control point, or maybe from the economy point is also very important. So why should somebody collaborate? So that is also another, becomes, there is some economy behind it. So that economy has to be taken care. So that is also another key point. That's what we have seen in the BHARAT VC case also. So we have been trying to do that one. So let us hope that this goes in the correct direction, as everybody has to promote open source.
Sure. Thank you, Ramesh. I think one important aspect that you brought out was, contribution by startup and academia. I think academia continues to be one of the greatest contributors in terms of, especially in the GovTech. So coming to you, Debrata, I know you've been part of a financial, I would say, what was a financial initiative many years back. Now it has become a financial giant, right? And certainly, I'm sure you would be using a lot of open source, within your own organization. So are you seeing any similar trends, what Ramesh just mentioned, on leveraging open source and opening up what you have built for others to adopt, especially you being a platform at the end of the day?
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Sasi, for giving the opportunity. So I'm quite new to this organization, so I'll not speak about that. What I will speak about how the industry trend is going in open source. So way back in 2003, when I started my PhD in IIT Bombay, so it was open source who was giving us the platform to leverage a lot of things and to build the things that will use in the later case. So having said that open source, my point is open source is called many eyes and many hands. What is the meaning of that? It is that many of the people will be burn their hands when they are using the open source, and many eyes are looking towards it, so that we thought that open source is not reliable, open source is not scalable, open source is not secure, which is actually not true. Open source it is in the other way, because it has been used by many eyes and many hands methods. So based on this, you can find out whenever, as you have rightly told, yes, financial system is a very, very important system in terms of the digital ecosystem that we are building. So financial system uses a lot of open source softwares like Ruby, Python, Java. So we use a lot of open source softwares, and based on these open source softwares, we built a lot of applications, and those applications has to be run with the traditionally develop the systems which is provided the proprietary vendors. So when there will be a interoperability will work along with the open source as well as the vendors side by side, you will find out the financial system is such a critical system that you cannot ignore to have a downtime of even 0.1%. So we have always 99.99% of reliability that you have to service uptime that you need to be maintained. So building this open source stack, yes, that requires a lot of expertise. One area what you have been mentioning is I have also a lot of interest about that, how actually you can build the manpower and the skilling of the people. That is the most important thing. And in that context, actually, a lot of schools nowadays, I think, need to be promote this open source. So which will be very, very important for, because there actually the investment will be not that much. But we, in my times, let me tell, even I passed from NIIT, then when I reached to IIT, then I could find out, yes, I could have a leverage of using the open source at that time. So if it is start in the school level, probably a lot of small projects can be done. And of course, as recently you have seen the Startup India, we have a huge program has happened in the Bangalore. There was a lot of open source projects comes and they have given demo during that time. So that way actually you will find out open source is not only finding its way, it is making an impact, and it will make an impact in the future. And of course, financial system is a very delicate system. So open source, whenever we take it, we not only, as Jeff was mentioning, you should not take it and then you leave it. You have to remediate it, you have to operate it, you have to secure it, then you have to use it, then you have to find out its life cycle, end of life cycle. So all these things that you have to monitor it. So that way actually open source also required a little bit of effort and to make it secure.
Sure. Thanks, Devrat. I think interesting point on many hands and many eyes, right? I think my own experience, if you don't understand the software, I think you can burn your hand very easily, right? I think that's very clear. And people are obviously watching you. I think it's, as I said, the point of expertise remains one of the, I mean, while you can develop expertise from school itself, you know, because of the availability of the software, but the change, the pace of change is too fast in open source, right? The contribution is very high, the pace of change is very fast. As Jeff mentioned, you don't know, it's secure, and Deepa ma'am also mentioned, it's secure today, it may not be secure tomorrow, right? Because the contribution is happening so much. So I think it's important that you have to keep pace with the technology, and certainly skills remain one of the key challenges. So coming to Golok, you know, you did mention about, you know, various initiatives that you're taking in Passport Seva, and you're leveraging open source, right? So any examples that you want to cite where you've been able to leverage OS very extensively and you've seen the benefits very early in the journey?
Oh, absolutely, Arnab. Two quick example I can quote. Now, I'm entirely shifting my network into a SDN-based network. Now, if I see the SDN-based network, if you see the SDN controller and the API it uses, right? It's purely based on, again, open source, right? And that is the advantage of SDN you get, you know, when you migrate from your, let's say, traditional to SDN way. And the other advantage of going that way is when we are developing your application, which is riding on a SDN network, right? The application, let's say, in my case, it is an enterprise application, Passport Seva program applications. Now, whatever be the variance I am looking in terms of, enhancing my application, most of my, as I said, the user interface and the service seeker interface, I'm trying to use the open source at maximum, whether it is Java, whether it is JSON, whether it is JBoss, all those tools I'm trying to maximum leverage at the user interface side, especially on the portal, the citizen portal, right? Now, from there on, if I look down from the citizen portal to the network layer, as I said, I'm riding through SDN network towards reaching to my data center. And then once I land it to my own data centers, then from the web tier to the app tier, and from app tier to the DB and storage tier. Since now I'm completely moving away from the logical way of segregation to a virtualized mode, and some of my application will continue to be hosted in the event cloud, because I'll have to now globally deal with all my global embassies and consulates. So there will be a cloud variance, there will be a on-premises kind of a load which will be catering to my Indian citizens, and then, as I said, the citizen interface. Now if I give another example on the cloud side, whether I know host it at any of these cloud providers, and no, we are hosting as per the METI guidelines. But what I am taking care of when I am hosting in the cloud, the variance of the application, I am making sure that the APIs through which I am hitting to the cloud, that should be purely based on open API, so that every developer will have equal level of freedom and control in terms of the code. No? So that is most important to understand. So that is how I am trying to leverage open source while I'm hitting to the cloud. The other area, no, in terms of somebody was saying that no, nothing comes free. What I have done when I'm trying to leverage open source as part of my ecosystem at large, there has to be a business model, and the business model which I have developed is, when I have floated the RFP, I have made it sure that the open source component, whatever it will be used at various segments of my entire ecosystem, that segments of open source, as if it is a proprietary software, as if it is a code software, that should purely become part of your business model. So why is that there will be a need to kind of a o-ring saying that just because I'm using this part of the open source component at this layer, I have to be worried about that? No, it must not be. That should be part and parcel of your design. That should be part and parcel of your RFP. That should be part and parcel your upgradation and enhance process over the lines to come and over the years to come. And that is where you need to evaluate when you are evaluating the bid, saying that the product you are getting as part of open source component, is that component no resilient enough, or kind of a, it will give me a confidence for all time to come. It's not for day one. And that's why I am saying that when you take open source component as part of your entire ecosystem, entire solution, you must ensure that that become parts and intrinsic to your business model. So you need not worry about the finance, you need not worry about upgrade and updates, and you also need not worry about the security concerns, which is a major concerns not today, whether it is a cyber part or internal part. The last thing I must say that since we all are discussing that we open source as a component, as I said, now it is time has come to see that one is your enterprise application. We all have enterprise application. I have passport, somebody will have GST, and somebody will have income tax, railway will have some applications, right? So one is the way you look into your enterprise applications. Another is leveraging open source for masses. Let me give a small example here. Let's say health system, the NHA system is coming up, right? National health system, right? Now, national health system, when it is, let's say, trying to capture the data at village level, let's say, they are trying to create a national health ID. Now, that applications which they are developing, that they are designing, that applications right from capturing the data to harnessing the data till it validates. Because now they will say that, okay, I am producing a passport as a document while I am trying to have hello.
Yeah, Goluk, we just lost you for a couple of seconds.
Yeah. So I just giving an example of National Health ID system, saying that when the National Health application capture the data at, let's say, remotest part of the country to create that National Health ID number, let's say they produce passport as a document. No, let's say Harnath produce passport as a document to get the National Health ID. What National Health ID will do? They'll try to see that the document being produced by Harnath is a genuine document or not. They will trigger that call for a validation to the passport database. Now that interface which is coming for validation to me, two part. One is that validation interface must have an open API to consume that validation API which I am exposing to, let's say, National Health ID. The second is to avoid multiple way of integration and multiple way of having multiple API. These core platform, for an example, today we have this DigiLocker platform. We have Aadhaar kind of a platform. So all those core platform which is routing the packet to these multiple departments for validation and authorization, they must have open standard-based APIs so that end-to-end consumption or exposing of the API should be based on an open source kind of an environment. So that is the another way of moving forward, and which I am seeing there is a lot of opportunity in that direction. So that is the way I'll put up, Anant Babu. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Golok. I think one point I think you reiterated is, again, building up the open APIs, right? At the end of the day, if the departments have to collaborate, they need open APIs and open standards. Makes it much more easier for interdepartmental, data exchange. And another point on the mass utilization of especially mass rollout. If you're trying to leverage closed source, it becomes more difficult. You may have to look at open source. And the most important part that you mentioned
business
is
model. Business model is very important or not. Business model we must evolve.
The business model around and again, it's all about solutioning, right? It has to be solution focused rather than component specific. And again, then again, I think the point comes very clearly that who supports, right? When you're touching large number of citizens, somebody has to support, right? So coming to you, Dr. Sudarshan, what do you think from your point of view? Have you seen any benefits of open source? I think Golok did mention about a couple of them, but basis your experience, what do you think? Are you seeing any benefits of open source in your organization or the initiative that you've been taking in C-DAC?
Yeah, so open source, not one or two benefits, it has been tremendous. The key is by keeping it zero budget exercise, they don't get the visibility that they deserve for the percentage that they have become the invisible, winners in the game in the end. So generically, even the Lipi software that C-DAC spearheaded in the early days, which was word processing and editing software and things like that. So like that, and then pre-Unicode, all the device drivers and the fonts driver that were coded by C-DAC, they were all available in public in a open, free, usable way. And the way the contribution has come is in multiple phases. One part is where it is a executable or a DLL that can be used. So more like a black box, but as a components, open source or freely usable components. And then the second aspect where the code itself is available for others. The way traditionally we consider open source as open source. So they are also available. And then right now we are trying to work out, we do use GitHub kind of things. So that means things are open. How do you make it, just like Golok mentioned, a business part, how to make it a part of the process so that, the question of IP becomes open IP rather than IP exclusions, approvals, all these process we have to get out. So from that perspective, the few efforts are currently going on to make sure that more and more development that we do becomes available to one and all. And there is a strong effort going on, for example, under NLTM, National Language Technology Mission, where some of our premier institutes are also involved to make sure The code is available openly. Similarly, as part of the semiconductor, Atmanirbhar mission that currently we are talking about various schemes. How do we make all the IP cores also available, freely accessible, which can be extended by individual firms? A lot of efforts are currently ongoing as well, in addition to what has so far been done. So that way, I will say there are two aspects in which we are strongly contributing and going forward. One is freely available components, where cost of development is less and time to develop is also less because the component or module is available. The second one is where the code itself is open. The only challenge, just to reiterate, we are finding when you want to give an open source per se, is allocating resources when there is no budget available. Because our salary doesn't come out of treasury straight away. It has to be covered some way. So how do we manage that? So that is where if there is a economic sustainability model is brought out. Remember earlier days we used to don't talk about purchase price because the total cost of ownership. Similarly, if you look at move the cost part away but convert it into economy model, then this will go a long way. So while we are doing quite a bit of efforts under various aspects, we do host it on our website or a social media site, whatever we do. The sustenance part has been a kind of challenge because the moment funding stops from the funding source, the project kind of comes to a crashing halt. That is the only place where academic institutes have a slightly better advantage because they have a research scholars and student community who can be available even if it is on a part-time basis. And similarly, there are few commercial organizations, I know you may also be aware, they dedicate certain percentage of employees or certain percentage of employee time to open source. Something similar we have to extend it to government agencies. So like Ramesh sir also mentioned, how to make their internal collaboration into PAN collaboration with industry, startup and other agencies. That requires allocating certain amount of resources. And I think our Dr. Nayak is also there. Good to see him in the new avatar. So there, it is much more financial. So whenever there is a cyber security aspect, the transparency becomes more important. So open source has a much larger role to play. So I think, he will also contribute from NPCA side. So I'm pretty sure not just the C-DAC, but the entire government machinery, as you mentioned rightly, GovTech agencies, they will come and collaborate. I'm very confident, sir. We are seeing probably gear 1. We'll shift to gear 2, gear 3 very soon. That is what I believe.
So I think Dr. Sudarshan, very clearly you stated that, I think it's not only about utilizing the software, but it's also about contributing back. I think Golok was also very clear that there has to be a methodology of contributing back, open APIs, and ensuring that departments are integrated and also are giving it back to the community. And obviously, open source certainly can be benefited if more hands are there. Right? I think very, very important point. So coming to you, Ramesh, what are the potential risks that you've seen with OSSC? You did say that you've been using extensively the open source, but have you seen any specific risks, right? And how are you mitigating some of those risks, especially when they are touching the larger citizen base or larger programs, which are mission critical by all nature?
Yeah, security management, risk management is really a very tough job. So one has to really give attention to all the aspects of the software that is being deployed. So internally, we have a alerting mechanism within our organization. So we keep a watch on various security, TB entries and other things that is being. First of all, we have an inventory of what is deployed actually, and then who is using the deployments. So we link that and we identify key persons who are taking care of those systems. So whenever we get feed, and we have an internal cert mechanism also, there is a NIC cert. So NIC cert alerts us that there is a new vulnerability coming up and this is a solution. We in Open Technology Group, we guide people to close those vulnerabilities. So either we need to address the risk. In many ways we can address the risk. One simple way is that if the update is there, we can instruct them to do an updation. So many a times upgrade and update may not be possible. because of various software dependencies and other things. In those cases, we try to give a workaround. Maybe we say that can you withdraw that particular module for some time, or is there is a configuration which can prevent that one. Or in the worst case, we have to say evaluate within the NIC, then there are various security controls are available. So whether the particular risk, we have to evaluate the risk pertaining to our deployment environment also. A risk may not directly be potential in our environment. Maybe it's generally it is there is a risk is known, and maybe there is a exploit is also available. But we need to see whether somebody can execute that exploit in our environment. Maybe it is requiring a remote authenticated user on the system to do it, or it is a remotely accessing user without any authentication. Can he deploy that attack? For example, this Log4j kind of a buffer overflow attacks and those kind of things can be mounted without being authenticated to the system. So those are the things that we need to take care and really make an assessment and see that whether it is going to impact us and what is going to be the impact. So whether we are going to lose data or it is going to be maybe a service block attack. So based on that, we do remedial action. So we have a good internal alerting mechanism through which we alert people and they take proactive measures also. And certain times we do exemptions also, what we call as VA moderation, risk analysis and exemption cases. Suppose the patch is not available. We have seen this happening in the community-based deployments. So when you have Linux deployments, you have Red Hat and you have CentOS, you have Ubuntu, those kind of things. So sometimes the patch flow is not very quick enough. So Red Hat might have released a patch, or upstream might have released a patch in a community software that might not be available in your community repository. So in those cases, we really look into those aspects and give the workarounds or configurations or environmental analysis we do. And then we say that this risk is not really going to impact the way it is being projected. So we can go ahead with this, accept this risk and deploy our services. So we have a mechanism internally to monitor the risk and provide a proper remediation. So far we have been able to successfully go about it.
Sure.
So we are very happy about it that we have an internal mechanism to do it.
Sure. Thank you, Ramesh. I think Jeff did mention about the vulnerabilities, and again, you brought out very clearly that there are vulnerabilities in the open source, especially if you have a 0 day, then I think you really have to figure out whether do I need to apply a workaround or how do I protect my, especially the Log4j situation happened, right? So I think all of us really rushed to fixing it. And certainly availability of patches becomes a...
Arnad, we have Jeff still on the panel if you want to ask one or question with Jeff. He's still there.
Yeah, sure. I'll ask question to Jeff as well. Especially, availability of patches continues to be a problem. Another thing that I've seen, is typically with open source, you have, IP issues, or you would have, the best development practices. Not all developers or not all contributors use the best development practices, especially. So, so coming to you, Devrita, what's your experience? What are the risks that you're seeing, especially as you mentioned, it's a large platform which many organizations are connected to, especially if fintech organizations are connected to, or financial institutions are connected to. How are you really making sure that your platform is, safer, or what are the risks that you're seeing from a platform perspective?
So what actually we do, we have two systems. One is called as we use open source software, as well as we have a production system where actually you can directly develop the softwares. When you develop the various softwares, and in that context, when you are using the open source softwares, so basically what need to be done, you have to do a later stage, you normally do a software scanning analysis. When you do the software scanning analysis, then you find out what are your set of vulnerability analysis. But what actually I am proposing, instead of doing that, you do the software composition analysis. What is actually the software composition analysis means? When you do the software development process using the open source software, during that process, you do a software composition analysis. The moment you do the software composition analysis, you can find out the lot of vulnerability that you need not have to find out later stage, when actually you have to run the vulnerability scanner and you have to find out. This is the number A. Number B, you have to keep on updating your OSAP top 10. The OSAP top 10 is very, very critical and important. That is which was provided, and the SANS top 25. And these are the things that which has been provided, and that has to be used. And based on this, you have to do the your mechanism, and then you have to see whether the system has been secure or not by doing these processes. And the third important thing is, whenever you are doing a software development analysis processes, the most important process is the design process. If you are not build a secure by design principle, so that will be not develop any processes, or you have to analyze secure by design processes. So now actually why it is coming as secure by design processes, and the most important thing is coming not security by design. When I say secure by design, there is two things involved. One is called security by design. The other is called as nowadays privacy by design. So these are the two things now need to be take consideration. Since we are in the financial institutions, we have to consider also the privacy aspects into considerations. Unlike in other organization where there is a very little scope of privacy aspect to be taken care. So that way, actually, these are the important things that need to be taken care. And beside this, you have to run your lot of tools to run, and then you have to find out the based on CBSS scoring mechanism, the MyTrip. Whenever you do the open source use, you have to use the SCA analysis mechanism, and then you may not end up having a lot of vulnerability. That will be a great use for your organization.
Sure. I think secure by design is, I think, the fundamental principle that I think we have to follow. Certainly security comes as one of the key priorities. So Jeff, coming to you, if I may pull you in the panel discussion, you've heard the panelists and you've seen how they've been leveraging open source in the GovTech. They've been having challenges as well as benefits, right? And you did mention about in your session 30 years with the open source community and contribution. Do you resonate with some of the thoughts that the panelists have shared thus far? And any specific inputs that you want to share, or you think that the challenges that everybody is facing, or at least looking, be it skill sets or be it security, be it secure by design or contribution, open APIs, whatever you heard, right? What's your experience on some of these aspects?
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts. First, I would say, I like the idea of secure by design. However, there's a tendency to turn that into what I would call big design up front or over architecting systems. And I believe the best way to achieve security is in an agile DevOps kind of way. So that means breaking the work into small pieces and doing it over the course of a whole project. If you try to design security up front entirely, you'll definitely get it wrong. And you'll make a lot of mistakes and you'll have to rework a lot of things as you go. So I encourage you to do it in pieces, do it agilely, and you'll end up with a design that's secure, but you won't have done what I would call, design up front. It's just too much. And with regard to open source, I would say you really just need to focus on keeping it simple. Your processes don't have to be incredibly complicated here. You need to have an inventory of your open source. So you need to know what you're using, what versions you're using. I encourage you to keep that database up to date all the time and monitor it for known vulnerabilities, but mostly just make it part of your culture that you keep your libraries pretty close to up to date, always. It'll end up being much more efficient for you because the scope of the changes you'll need in order to respond to a new vulnerability will be much smaller. If you're on like 10 versions of Log4j ago, when that vulnerability comes out, now you've got to upgrade, a huge jump. But if you're on, 1.15, and the vulnerability comes out and you need to update to 1.16 and then 1.17, it's a small jump that you're used to making all the time. So those are just, a couple of reactions here. I think it's important to keep making the case for open source, that it's the right way to do things. It's the most secure way to build systems these days. And I guess my last point is, take it easy on the developers here. Vulnerabilities happen in both open source and custom code. I've made plenty of vulnerabilities after a lifetime of teaching secure code. I still make mistakes and introduce vulnerabilities. That's why it's important to support development teams with processes and tools that will keep them on the path. I encourage you not to blame them. And if there's a vulnerability, let's support them. Let's figure out, how did that happen? Can we enhance our build system so that we don't introduce that again? If it's an open source project, don't jump down their throat. I think there were 3 people maintaining Log4j. 3 people in a library that's used in every critical system across the globe, running as root in every data center in every financial institution in the world. 3 people responsible for that code. And they took a lot of bad feedback during that incident that they didn't need. What they needed is support and patience and understanding, because everyone in the world is taking a free ride on their work. So fortunately, some folks, including Contrast, stepped up and contributed money to the Apache Foundation to try to help support those developers in in their efforts to provide critical code that we're all taking advantage of.
Sure. Thanks, Jeff. I think maybe good closing points in terms of, staying agile in terms of security, keep it simple, possibly
Arnath, I
own it.
just want to add one point.
Yeah, Deeprita, please.
Yeah, actually, I just want to say security should not be an afterthought. It is must. We should not break into pieces and develop, later integrate, find out, and then say, hey, we have so many security issues. So let's have security should not have afterthought. So security must be started with by design, coding, requirement analysis, production-based testing, delivery to the systems, then maintaining the lifecycle processes. So security should be must, not an afterthought.
Sure. I think depending on the scenario, but
Yes.
Great point. I think I think the bottom line is keep it simple, own rather than just, open source. While it is open, you have to own the platform that you are leveraging and stay up to date. I think Jeff could point on that, and keep the process and tools in place, because you tend to deviate when you have too much of an openness, right? So I think great points, and thanks a lot, gentlemen. I know we're already on top of the hour. We've taken a lot of time, but I'm sure the points mentioned by all of you have been very insightful for the audience. In fact, I learned a lot of things from the discussion today. Thanks a lot, and look forward to seeing you all soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Arnathji. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sasi.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks to all the panelists, and thanks to the moderator, Arnath, and each one of you for sharing your thoughts on the open source. Thank you, Jeff, all the way joining from so far. Thank you. Take care. All the best.
Thanks, everybody.
So now
Thank
we
you.
move to,
Bye.
yeah, Jeff. Yeah.